People say money changes you, but the truth is, it only unmasks who you really are. When Arthur traded his loyal girlfriend of 5 years for a woman dripping in Cartier and assumed wealth, he thought he had successfully hacked the socio-economic ladder. He believed he was leaving behind a life of budget spreadsheets and cramped apartments for private jets and Hamptons estates. But Arthur made a catastrophic miscalculation. He didn't know the quiet, unassuming woman he abandoned in a Brooklyn walk-up wasn't just a struggling artist. She was the hidden, sole heiress to a $1 trillion corporate empire, and her revenge would be absolute. The apartment in Bushwick, Brooklyn, was exactly the kind of place romanticized by 20-somethings who didn't actually have to live there forever. Exposed brick that constantly shed red dust, a radiator that clanged like a dying engine in the winter, and a window that offered a breathtaking view of a brick wall. For Chloe Beaumont, it was a sanctuary, a deliberate choice. For Arthur Pendleton, it was a prison he was desperately trying to claw his way out of. Arthur was a senior associate at a mid-tier financial advisory firm on Wall Street. He wore suits that were tailored just a fraction too tight, an aggressive signal of his ambition, and spent his evenings relentlessly networking at the Yale Club, a membership he could barely afford, subsidized by a diet of instant ramen and skipped lunches. He was handsome in a sharp, hungry way, with calculating blue eyes and a jawline that seemed permanently set in tension. Chloe, on the other hand, was his antithesis. She was deeply grounded, possessing a quiet elegance that didn't require expensive labels to broadcast itself. She worked as an archivist for a small historical society, earning a salary that barely covered her half of the rent. She wore vintage sweaters, pulled her dark hair into messy buns, and drove a dented 2012 Honda Civic. She was perfectly content with Sunday mornings reading the paper and cooking eggs in their tiny kitchen. Arthur used to love that about her. When they met in college at Cornell, Arthur there on a combination of crippling student loans and academic scholarships, Chloe there under the guise of an upper-middle-class suburban upbringing, he found her lack of pretense refreshing. But 5 years into the real world, the charm of her contentment had mutated into a source of profound irritation for him. "You don't even try, Chloe," Arthur snapped one Tuesday evening, tossing his leather briefcase onto the sagging IKEA sofa. "Sarah from compliance just got a promotion because she plays golf with the partners at Bethpage. When was the last time you networked? When was the last time you asked for a raise?" Chloe looked up from her laptop, adjusting her blue light glasses. "My non-profit relies on state grants, Arthur. There are no raises this year. And I love what I do. I'm preserving history. It matters." "History doesn't pay for a mortgage in Manhattan," he muttered, pouring himself a glass of cheap scotch. "It doesn't buy a summer house. It doesn't put you in the rooms where the actual world is run." Chloe remained silent, watching the amber liquid swirl in his glass. She knew the exact rooms Arthur was talking about. She had grown up in them. What Arthur didn't know, what absolutely no one in Chloe's adult life knew, was the true weight of her last name. She wasn't just Chloe Beaumont, daughter of a dentist and a teacher from Ohio, as her meticulously crafted cover story claimed. She was the only granddaughter of Richard Beaumont, the famously reclusive patriarch of Beaumont Global Holdings. Beaumont Global was not merely a company, it was a leviathan, operating out of heavily guarded, unmarked buildings in Geneva, London, and New York. It was the shadow architect of the global economy. They held controlling stakes in everything from the world's largest defense contractors to sprawling tech monopolies, and quietly managed assets exceeding $1.4 trillion. When Chloe turned 18, she had balked at the suffocating, gilded cage her family lived in. She had watched her parents' marriage disintegrate under the weight of immense wealth, devolving into a cold war of infidelity and corporate maneuvering. Desperate for authenticity, she had begged her grandfather for a reprieve. Richard Beaumont, a ruthless businessman but a doting grandfather, had agreed to a social experiment. She could live an anonymous, middle-class life until her 30th birthday. Her trust fund, containing a staggering $400 billion in liquid assets and voting shares, was locked behind impenetrable legal trusts managed by J.P. Morgan Chase's highest-level private bank. Chloe wanted to know if she could be loved for herself, not for her portfolio. For 5 years, she genuinely believed Arthur was the answer. But then, Arthur met Victoria Kensington. It happened at a charity gala at the Pierre Hotel, an event Arthur had spent a month's salary to attend. Victoria was the daughter of Charles Kensington, a prominent New York real estate developer worth roughly $800 million. In the grand scheme of global wealth, the Kensingtons were loud, flashy new money. To Arthur, however, they were gods. Victoria was striking, wrapped in a shimmering Tom Ford gown, smelling of Baccarat Rouge and generational entitlement. She noticed Arthur immediately. He was hungry, good-looking, and possessed the exact kind of ruthless corporate ambition her father respected. Within weeks, Arthur's late nights at the office became late-night drinks at the Polo Bar. His weekend strategy meetings became weekend getaways to Victoria's family estate in Southampton. He began to view his life with Chloe not just as a stepping stone he had outgrown, but as an anchor dragging him down into mediocrity. Chloe noticed the shift, of course. She noticed the subtle scent of expensive perfume on his collars, the way he hid his phone screen, and most tellingly, the absolute contempt that began to lace his voice whenever he looked around their Brooklyn apartment. She waited, observing him with the cold, analytical patience she had inherited from her grandfather. The experiment was failing, but Chloe needed to see exactly how far Arthur would go. The climax arrived on a stiflingly humid evening in late August. The air conditioner in their bedroom had finally given out, and the apartment felt heavy, charged with the static of unspoken truths. Arthur walked through the door at 9 p.m. He wasn't wearing his usual exhausted slump. Instead, his shoulders were squared, his posture rigid with adrenaline. He bypassed the kitchen, ignoring the dinner Chloe had left warming on the stove, and walked straight into their small bedroom. Chloe stood in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. She watched as Arthur pulled a large Toomey suitcase from beneath the bed, a suitcase she had bought him for his birthday, and unzipped it with sharp, aggressive motions. "What are you doing, Arthur?" she asked, her voice calm, devoid of the panic he had likely anticipated. "I'm leaving, Chloe," he said, not making eye contact. He began pulling dress shirts from the closet, not bothering to fold them neatly. "I'm moving out." Chloe leaned against the doorframe. The silence in the apartment stretched, amplifying the sound of distant sirens and the frantic ticking of the wall clock. "Is it Victoria?" Arthur paused, his hand hovering over his collection of ties. He finally turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was a mixture of guilt and a cruel, overwhelming relief. "Yes," he admitted, his voice hardening. "But it's not just her, it's everything. Look around us, Chloe." He gestured wildly at the peeling paint, the scuffed floorboards, the stacks of library books on her nightstand. "I am drowning here. I am 28 years old, and I am killing myself to build a future while you are perfectly content to just exist. You have no drive. You have no ambition." "I have a life I enjoy," she replied quietly. "Enjoyment doesn't build a legacy," Arthur snapped, zipping his suitcase shut with finality. "Victoria understands what it takes to succeed in this city. Her family understands power. They operate on a completely different frequency than we do. I need a partner who can stand beside me in those rooms, Chloe, not someone who shrinks from them." Chloe felt a bizarre sensation washing over her. It wasn't the agonizing heartbreak she had always feared. It was a cold, crystalline clarity. The man standing before her wasn't the brilliant, idealistic student she had fallen in love with. He was a parasite, looking for a larger host. "So, you're trading up," Chloe said, her tone utterly flat. "Don't make it sound so cheap," Arthur countered, grabbing the handle of his suitcase. "I'm being realistic. We want different things. You want a quiet life of obscurity. I want to build an empire." The sheer, staggering irony of his words almost made Chloe laugh. An empire. Arthur thought a few $100 million in over-leveraged Manhattan real estate was an empire. "I see," Chloe said simply. Arthur seemed unnerved by her lack of hysterics. He hesitated at the front door. "I've paid the rent through the end of next month. You'll need to figure out a cheaper place to live after that. The security deposit is yours." He reached into his pocket and placed his key on the small entryway table. "I really am sorry, Chloe. But I have to look out for my future. Goodbye, Arthur," she said. He walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Chloe moved to the living room window. Down on the street, idling next to a fire hydrant, was a black Mercedes G-Wagon. Victoria Kensington was behind the wheel, tapping her manicured fingers against the steering wheel. Arthur threw his suitcase into the back, climbed into the passenger seat, and leaned over to kiss Victoria. The SUV sped off into the Brooklyn night, carrying Arthur toward what he believed was his ultimate triumph. Chloe stood at the window for 5 full minutes, watching the taillights disappear. The illusion was completely shattered. The man she had loved was a mirage, a construct of her own hopeful naivety. She walked over to her modest bookshelf, reaching behind a row of dusty encyclopedias. Her fingers found the hidden panel in the backboard. She pressed it, retrieving a heavy, sleek satellite phone that looked entirely out of place in the shabby apartment. It was a direct line, encrypted by former NSA engineers on the Beaumont payroll. She powered it on. It rang exactly once. "Miss Beaumont," a crisp, British-accented voice answered immediately. It was Thomas Sterling, the chief wealth manager and primary fixer for the Beaumont Family Trust at J.P. Morgan. "Hello, Thomas," Chloe said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly back into the authoritative cadence she had been trained in since childhood. "It has been quite a while, Mom. Is everything all right? Has the protocol been breached?" "The protocol is being terminated, Thomas," Chloe said, walking over to the cheap IKEA sofa and sitting down, her posture straightening into that of a CEO commanding a boardroom. "The experiment is over. I am returning to New York proper." "Understood, Ma'am. I will have the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue prepared immediately. Shall I arrange for the security detail to retrieve you?" "Yes. Give me 2 hours to pack the things I actually care about," Chloe instructed. She paused, looking at the key Arthur had left on the table. "And Thomas?" "Yes, Miss Beaumont?" "I need a complete forensic financial dossier on Charles Kensington and Kensington Real Estate Development. I want every outstanding loan, every leveraged asset, every private equity backer they rely on. Furthermore, find out which financial advisory firm handles their acquisitions. Consider it done by morning, Ma'am. May I ask what the objective is?" Chloe's eyes were cold, reflecting the dim light of the street lamp outside. "I'm going to show someone what a real empire looks like." For the next 6 months, Arthur Pendleton lived in a state of euphoric delusion. Moving in with Victoria Kensington was like stepping into a parallel universe where friction didn't exist. Her duplex on the Upper East Side spanned 4,000 square feet, boasting panoramic views of Central Park, a private elevator, and a full-time housekeeper. Arthur's mornings no longer began with the chaotic, sweaty crush of the subway. They began with espresso served on a marble terrace, followed by a chauffeured ride to the financial district in a private town car. Victoria was a whirlwind of social obligations. They attended galas at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, spent weekends skiing in Aspen, and dined at Le Bernardin so frequently that the maitre d' knew Arthur by name. Arthur felt he had finally arrived. He wore bespoke suits from Savile Row, paid for by a generous advance from Victoria's father, and sported a Patek Philippe Nautilus on his wrist. Professionally, his proximity to the Kensington wealth acted like rocket fuel. His firm, Oakmont Financial Advisory, was a prestigious but hungry boutique firm. When Charles Kensington decided to retain Oakmont for a massive new project, the partners practically fell over themselves to accommodate him. Arthur, despite being relatively junior, was immediately promoted to vice president and placed at the forefront of the Kensington account. "You're a natural at this, Arthur," Charles Kensington boomed one afternoon, clapping Arthur on the back in his mahogany-paneled corner office. Charles was a large, florid man who treated everyone like an employee. "You understand the aggression required. My daughter has good taste." Arthur beamed, ignoring the slight condescension in the older man's tone. "Thank you, sir. We're going to make sure this acquisition goes exactly as planned." The acquisition in question was the crown jewel of Charles Kensington's career. He was attempting to absorb a massive, struggling portfolio of commercial high-rises in Midtown Manhattan. It was a highly leveraged play. Kensington was putting up almost all of his company's liquid capital as collateral to secure the financing. If it succeeded, it would double his net worth and cement his legacy. Arthur was leading the risk assessment and structural financing. He was working 80-hour weeks, fueled by adrenaline and arrogance. He rarely thought of Chloe. When he did, it was with a brief flash of pity. He imagined her still stuck in that hot Bushwick apartment, eating takeout and organizing dusty historical files, entirely oblivious to the monumental deals shaping the skyline above her. But what Arthur and Charles Kensington didn't know was that the very skyline they were trying to conquer was already owned. 50 blocks south of Oakmont Financial, in a sprawling, ultra-secure suite of offices overlooking the Statue of Liberty, Chloe Beaumont sat at the head of a 20-foot glass conference table. She was no longer wearing vintage sweaters. She was dressed in a razor-sharp Saint Laurent suit, her hair styled in a sleek, immaculate blowout. Surrounding her were 12 of the most ruthlessly brilliant financial minds in the world. Senior partners from Goldman Sachs, legal sharks from Wachtell Lipton, and Thomas Sterling, who stood quietly at her right hand. They were reviewing the holographic projections of the Kensington real estate portfolio. "They are overextended, Miss Beaumont," stated David Aris, the lead acquisition strategist for Aegis Holdings. Aegis was one of the many shadowy shell corporations completely controlled by the Beaumont family trust. To the public, Aegis was a faceless institutional investor. To Wall Street insiders, it was a predator that never missed a kill. "Charles Kensington has tied up 60% of his operating capital in the Midtown acquisition," David continued, pointing a laser at the financial models. "He's relying on a syndicated loan from a consortium of mid-tier banks, brokered by Oakmont Financial. If those banks get spooked and pull out at the 11th hour, Kensington won't be able to cover the margin calls. His entire corporate structure will domino." Chloe tapped a platinum pen against the glass table, her gaze fixed on the name Arthur Pendleton, listed as the lead VP on the Oakmont dossier. "We don't just want him to domino, David," Chloe said, her voice eerily calm, resonating with absolute authority. I want to own the board he's playing on." Thomas Sterling cleared his throat. "We hold significant leverage over two of the primary banks in Kensington's lending consortium. We can easily pressure them to review their risk parameters and withdraw their commitments, citing market volatility. However, if we do that, Kensington will simply scramble for private equity." "He won't have time," Chloe countered smoothly, "because while the banks are pulling their funding, Aegis is going to initiate a hostile takeover of Kensington real estate development itself." The room went completely silent. Even the seasoned sharks looked surprised. "A hostile takeover of a privately held, family-run real estate firm?" David asked, raising an eyebrow. "Miss Beaumont, that is highly unusual and incredibly expensive." "I am aware of the cost," Chloe replied, her eyes narrowing. "Charles Kensington has spent the last decade using questionable mezzanine financing to fund his lifestyle. He has quietly sold off minority, non-voting shares of his holding company to various private equity funds to keep his cash flow looking healthy. I want Aegis to buy out every single one of those minority stakeholders, offer them triple the market value, buy the debt, buy the leverage. I want Aegis to be Kensington's sole creditor." She stood up, leaning over the table. "When the Midtown deal collapses, because we pulled the bank funding, Kensington will be technically insolvent. He will be forced to restructure, and when he looks across the table at his primary creditor to beg for a lifeline, he's going to see us." Thomas Sterling smiled a thin, dangerous smile. "It is a beautifully violent strategy, Miss Beaumont. We will begin quietly purchasing the minority shares and the debt obligations immediately. We can spring the trap in exactly 3 weeks, right as Oakmont Financial attempts to close the Midtown acquisition." "Perfect," Chloe said, turning toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. Arthur had wanted a partner who operated on a different frequency. He had wanted someone who understood power. He was about to get exactly what he asked for, delivered with a force that would shatter his fragile, borrowed empire into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. 3 weeks later, Arthur Pendleton woke up in Victoria's silk sheets, feeling invincible. It was closing day. Today, Oakmont Financial would finalize the syndication for the Midtown project. His commission alone would be deep into the 7 figures. He mentally picked out the color of the Porsche. 911 he was going to buy that afternoon. He kissed a sleeping Victoria on the forehead, dressed in his finest Tom Ford suit, and took the private elevator down to his waiting car. When he walked onto the trading floor at Oakmont Financial at 8 a.m., however, the atmosphere was not celebratory. It was chaotic. Phones were ringing incessantly. Junior analysts were sprinting across the floor, their faces pale. Arthur's stomach gave a slight lurch. He walked quickly to his office. His managing partner, an imposing man named Richard Vance. Wait, let's call him Gregory Sterling. No, Gregory Trent. Gregory Trent was pacing furiously behind Arthur's desk. "Gregory, what's going on? Are the transfer wires delayed?" Arthur asked, setting his briefcase down. Trent looked at Arthur with wild, bloodshot eyes. "Delayed? Arthur, the wires are dead. The deal is dead." Arthur froze. "What are you talking about? First National and Sovereign Bank signed the term sheets on Tuesday. They are legally bound. They pulled out at 4 a.m., Trent shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. They cited an unforeseen catastrophic risk assessment regarding the Kensington Holding Company. They invoked the Material Adverse Change Clause. "That's impossible," Arthur yelled, panic finally clawing at his throat. "Kensington's financials are solid. We audited them ourselves. There is no adverse change." "Tell that to the market, Arthur," Trent snarled, turning his laptop around to face him. Arthur stared at the Bloomberg terminal screen. He felt all the blood drain from his face, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. Overnight, a massive, unannounced consolidation of Kensington real estate's debt had occurred. An unknown entity had bought up hundreds of millions of dollars of Kensington's mezzanine debt and minority shares, instantly calling in covenants that Charles Kensington had likely forgotten even existed. "Who?" Arthur stammered, his perfect corporate facade cracking instantly. "Who is doing this?" "A shell corporation called Aegis Holdings," Trent said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "They aren't just blowing up the Midtown deal, Arthur. They are initiating a hostile takeover of Charles Kensington's entire company. They own his debt. They own him." Arthur stumbled backward, collapsing into a leather guest chair. His mind raced. If Charles Kensington was ruined, Victoria was ruined. If the Kensington account defaulted, Oakmont Financial would face catastrophic losses. Arthur wouldn't just lose his commission. He would be the scapegoat. His career would be over before it truly began. The phone on his desk rang. It was an internal line from the front reception desk. Trent answered it on speaker. "Mr. Trent." The receptionist's voice trembled slightly. "There are several lawyers here from Wachtel Lipton, accompanied by representatives from Aegis Holdings. They are demanding an immediate meeting regarding the Kensington debt restructuring. They say they represent the new majority stakeholder." Trent looked at Arthur, his face ashen. "Send them up to the main boardroom." Arthur stood up on shaking legs. He smoothed his expensive tie, trying desperately to summon the arrogant confidence he had wielded so effortlessly just hours prior. He had to fix this. He was a master of the room. He just needed to negotiate with this faceless Aegis Holdings. He followed Trent down the long, glass hallway toward the executive boardroom. The heavy oak doors were open. Inside, surrounded by an army of stone-faced corporate lawyers and financial fixers, sat the architect of his destruction. Arthur walked into the room, prepared to introduce himself to the ruthless executive who had orchestrated this bloodbath. He stopped dead in his tracks. The breath was violently knocked from his lungs. Sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Thomas Sterling, and looking more powerful than any CEO Arthur had ever encountered, was the woman he had abandoned in a Bushwick apartment 6 months ago. Chloe Beaumont looked up, her eyes locking onto Arthur's terrified face. She didn't smile. She simply steepled her fingers, the very picture of absolute, terrifying control. "Hello, Arthur," Chloe said, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. "Please take a seat. We have a lot of history to discuss." The silence in the Oakmont Financial Executive Boardroom was absolute, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic impact. The panoramic views of the Manhattan skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed entirely disconnected from the reality imploding inside the room. Arthur Pendleton stood frozen, just a few feet past the heavy oak doors. His mind aggressively rejected the visual data his eyes were providing. He blinked rapidly, expecting the hallucination to clear. Chloe was supposed to be in Bushwick. She was supposed to be cataloging dust-covered municipal records for $40,000 a year. She was certainly not supposed to be sitting in a custom-tailored Saint Laurent suit, flanked by 5 of the most terrifyingly expensive corporate litigators in the hemisphere. "Chloe?" Arthur breathed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy pitch. He looked around the room, bewildered. What are you doing here? Do you work for them?" He pointed a trembling finger at the Wachtel Lipton attorneys. In his desperate, scrambling brain, it was the only logical conclusion. Perhaps she had gotten a job as a paralegal or an executive assistant. Gregory Trent, Arthur's managing partner, shot him a look of profound confusion mixed with rising terror. Pendleton, what the hell are you talking about? You know the principle of aegis?" Before Arthur could formulate a response, the older man sitting to Chloe's right stood up. It was Thomas Sterling, his British accent slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "Allow me to clarify the room's dynamics for you, Mr. Trent, and for your vice president," Thomas said smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. "This is Miss Chloe Beaumont. She is the principal director of Aegis Holdings and the sole operating executor of the Beaumont Global Trust." The blood drained entirely from Gregory Trent's face. He stumbled backward, his hip catching the edge of the mahogany table. Beaumont. In the uppermost echelons of global finance, the Beaumont name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones. They didn't just participate in markets, they made them. They possessed the kind of generational, sovereign-level wealth that could topple small governments and buy out Fortune 500 companies with petty cash. Arthur's knees gave out. He collapsed heavily into the nearest leather chair. The name echoed in his skull, bouncing against the memories of the last 5 years. Chloe Beaumont, the cheap dinners, the arguments about ambition, the way he had lectured her on how the real world worked. A wave of nausea so violent it almost blinded him washed over his body. "Miss Beaumont," Trent stammered, his arrogant bluster entirely evaporated, replaced by the fawning subservience of a man staring down the barrel of a financial firing squad. Oakmont Financial had no idea Aegis was a Beaumont proxy. If we had known, we would have never... You would have never attempted to broker a syndicated loan for a profoundly over-leveraged fraud like Charles Kensington?" Chloe interrupted. Her voice was serene, completely devoid of the emotional hysteria Arthur had expected. It was the voice of an apex predator. "But you did, Mr. Trent. You failed to perform adequate due diligence. You looked at the Kensington name and saw a quick 7-figure commission, ignoring the fact that his entire empire was built on a foundation of decaying mezzanine debt." Chloe slid a thick, leather-bound dossier across the long table. It stopped precisely in front of Trent. "As of 6 a.m. this morning, Aegis Holdings has legally acquired 68% of Kensington Real Estate Development's outstanding debt, previously held by a fractured coalition of private equity funds," Chloe explained, leaning back in her chair. "Upon review of those debt contracts, we discovered 3 distinct violations of liquidity covenants. Mr. Kensington is in technical default." Arthur stared at her, his jaw slack. He didn't recognize this woman. The soft, accommodating girl he had manipulated and eventually discarded was gone. In her place was a titan, wielding corporate law like a broadsword. "We are calling the loans, Mr. Trent," Chloe continued, "all of them, immediately. Kensington has 72 hours to produce $950 million in liquid capital, or Aegis will seize all of his collateralized assets, including his holding company, his ongoing projects, and his personal estates." Trent was sweating profusely. "Miss Beaumont, please. Kensington is Oakmont's largest client. If he goes into receivership, the reputational damage to this firm, the exposure, it will ruin us." "That is exactly why I am here," Chloe said, finally shifting her gaze directly to Arthur. Her eyes were devoid of anger, which somehow made it infinitely worse. They were just empty, assessing him like a poorly performing stock she was about to short. "I am offering Oakmont Financial a singular, non-negotiable exit strategy." "Anything?" Trent agreed instantly, practically begging. "Name it." "You will drop Kensington Real Estate Development entirely. You will publicly rescind your advisory role, citing irreconcilable discrepancies found during your internal audits," Chloe dictated. "Furthermore, you will terminate Arthur Pendleton's employment, effective immediately, for gross negligence and failure to adhere to standard fiduciary risk assessments regarding the Kensington account." Arthur gasped, the sound loud and wet in the silent room. "Chloe, please! You can't do this! You're destroying my life over a breakup." Chloe tilted her head slightly, a gesture so cold it lowered the temperature in the room. "A breakup, Arthur? Do not flatter yourself. You are a 5-year social experiment in observing the limits of human mediocrity and greed. I am not destroying your life because you left me. I am firing you because you are a spectacularly incompetent financial advisor who tied his firm's fate to a sinking ship just because the captain's daughter bought you a nice watch." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the Patek Philippe, peeking out from beneath his sleeve. "A watch, I might add, that Charles Kensington bought using funds diverted from a failing commercial project in Chicago, a detail you would have caught if you had spent more time reading his balance sheets and less time playing golf in Southampton." Trent didn't even hesitate. He turned to Arthur, his expression twisting into a mask of pure corporate survival. "Pendleton, you're done. Leave your keycard on the desk. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal items. You have 10 minutes. Arthur looked back and forth between Trent and Chloe, his chest heaving. The reality of his absolute, inescapable ruin was finally settling in. He had traded an empire he didn't know existed for a mirage that was currently turning to dust. "You're a monster," Arthur whispered, tears of humiliation finally spilling over his eyelashes. "No, Arthur," Chloe said quietly, standing up and buttoning her suit jacket. "I'm just realistic. We want different things. You wanted to build an empire. I already owned one. Good luck with your future." The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the pavement outside the Oakmont Financial Building. Arthur stood on the sidewalk, holding a small cardboard box containing a framed photo, a novelty mug, and a dying succulent. His bespoke Tom Ford suit suddenly felt suffocating, a costume he had no right to wear. He didn't call the private town car. He couldn't. His corporate expense account had been frozen before he even reached the lobby. He hailed a yellow cab, sliding into the sticky vinyl back seat, and gave the driver the address for Kensington Real Estate Development's headquarters at Hudson Yards. He had to warn Charles. He had to warn Victoria. Maybe, if they moved fast enough, they could find a white knight, a rogue billionaire, a foreign sovereign wealth fund, anyone who could inject nearly $1 billion of liquidity into the holding company before the 72-hour window closed. When Arthur arrived at the sprawling, glass-enclosed Kensington offices, the atmosphere was already vibrating with panic. Rumors travel on Wall Street faster than the speed of light. The news that Oakmont had publicly severed ties with Kensington had hit the Bloomberg terminals 10 minutes prior. Arthur bypassed the frantic reception desk and practically sprinted toward Charles Kensington's corner office. He pushed open the heavy double doors without knocking. Charles Kensington was standing behind his massive desk, his face a terrifying shade of purple. He was screaming into a phone, his normally booming voice reduced to a hoarse, panicked bark. "What do you mean you can't arrange a bridge loan? I am Charles Kensington. I have $3 billion in unbuilt assets. I don't care about the covenants. Get me Skadden Arps on the line right now." He slammed the phone down so hard the plastic cracked. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Arthur. For a second, relief washed over his face. "Arthur, thank God. Tell me Oakmont is pulling a tactical maneuver. Tell me Trent is just trying to renegotiate the syndication fees to cover the gap." Arthur set his cardboard box down on a leather sofa. He felt physically sick. "Oakmont is gone, Charles. Trent fired me. They're dropping you completely." Kensington stared at him, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight. What are you talking about? Who the hell is Aegis Holdings? My CFO just told me some ghost entity bought up every scrap of our mezzanine debt and is issuing margin calls on the entire portfolio. Who is doing this? It's the Beaumont family, Arthur said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Aegis is a proxy for the Beaumont Global Trust. Charles Kensington literally staggered, grabbing the edge of his desk to keep from collapsing. The colour drained out of his florid face, leaving him looking sickly and old. He knew exactly what that meant. Every real estate developer in the world knew what it meant to cross the Beaumonts. It wasn't just a loss of capital, it was an execution. The Beaumonts? Charles whispered, his arrogance completely shattered. Why? We don't operate in their tier. We've never crossed them. Why would they weaponize $1 billion to wipe me out? Arthur opened his mouth to explain, to confess the humiliating truth that this entire corporate apocalypse was the result of his infidelity. But the office door swung open again. Victoria walked in. She was dressed impeccably in a white Chanel boucle suit, holding a matching lambskin bag. She had just come from a charity luncheon at Le Coucou. She looked beautiful, expensive, and entirely oblivious to the fact that her world was burning down around her. "Dad, what is going on?" she asked, her brow furrowing, as she looked at her father's pale face and then at Arthur's cardboard box. "My black card was just declined at Bergdorf's. The fraud department said the primary accounts are frozen." Charles looked at his daughter, his eyes filling with a terrifying, hollow despair. "We're done, Victoria. Aegis Holdings called the loans. They've triggered a cascading default. They're seizing the holding company. We have 72 hours before they take the duplex, the Southampton house, everything." Victoria froze. Her perfect, symmetrical features slackened. She looked at her father, then slowly turned her gaze to Arthur. The warmth and affection she usually reserved for him vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating calculus. "Arthur," she said, her voice tight and high-pitched. "You told me the Midtown syndication was bulletproof. You said you had the banks locked down." "I did," Arthur pleaded, stepping toward her, desperate for an ally. "Victoria, please, you have to understand. Aegis Holdings, it's Chloe, my ex-girlfriend. She's the sole heir to the Beaumont Trust. She orchestrated this entire takeover just to get back at me." Victoria stopped backing away and stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and utter disgust. "Are you out of your mind? Your mousy little archivist from Brooklyn is a Beaumont? And she just bankrupted my family because you cheated on her." "We can fight this," Arthur lied desperately, reaching out to grab her hand. "We'll get lawyers. We'll stall them in court. I still have connections." Victoria violently snatched her hand away, taking a step back, as if he were physically contaminated. The illusion of their grand romance dissolved in an instant, revealing the transactional reality Arthur had willfully ignored. She didn't love him. She had loved the utility he provided, the prestige he was supposed to bring to her family's empire. Without that, he was nothing but a liability. "Fight them with what, Arthur?" Victoria spat, her voice laced with pure venom. "With your cardboard box? With the $0 in your bank account? You arrogant, stupid man. You brought a $1 trillion apex predator right to our doorstep, and you didn't even know it." "Victoria, please. I love you," Arthur begged, his voice breaking. "Get out," she snarled, pointing at the door. "Get out of my father's office. Get out of my apartment. If I ever see you again, I will have security throw you onto the street." Arthur stood there for a long moment, the devastating finality of his choices echoing in the silent, opulent office. He had chased the illusion of wealth and discarded genuine loyalty, only to discover too late that he had profoundly misunderstood the nature of both. He picked up his cardboard box, the dying succulent leaning precariously to one side. He didn't look back as he walked out of the office, down the long glass corridor, and into the elevator. When he reached the street level, the Manhattan sky had turned an angry, bruised grey. It was beginning to rain. Arthur Pendleton stood on the sidewalk, a ruined man holding a box of trash, staring up at the towering skyscrapers. For the first time in his life, he realized how small he truly was. The 72-hour window provided by Aegis Holdings was not a grace period. It was a psychological torture chamber designed specifically for Charles Kensington. For 3 days, the Kensington Real Estate Development headquarters resembled a war room on the brink of absolute defeat. Charles, fueled by a dangerous mixture of Scotch and sheer desperation, mobilized every contact in his Rolodex. He called the titans of private equity, Stephen Schwartzman at Blackstone, Mark Rowan at Apollo Global Management, and the senior partners at KKR. He pleaded, he bargained, he offered equity stakes that bordered on extortionate. But Wall Street is a village, and the village had already received its orders. The Whisper Network had disseminated a single, chilling fact. Aegis Holdings is a Beaumont proxy. No one, no matter how hungry for distressed assets, was willing to step into the crosshairs of the Beaumont Global Trust. $1 billion was a rounding error to Chloe's family, but to these private equity firms, fighting a sovereign-level entity in a protracted legal war was a fiduciary nightmare. One by one, Charles's calls went unreturned. His friends at the Union Club suddenly found their schedules entirely booked. At exactly 9 a.m. on the 4th day, the guillotine fell. A fleet of black Cadillac Escalades pulled up to the curb outside the Kensington building at Hudson Yards. Chloe Beaumont did not attend this particular execution. She was already back in her Geneva headquarters, analyzing emerging markets in Southeast Asia. She had dispatched Thomas Sterling and David Harris to handle the janitorial work. They walked into Charles Kensington's corner office, accompanied by a federal bankruptcy judge's receiver and a team of forensic accountants from Deloitte. Charles was slumped in his leather chair, wearing the same rumpled suit from 3 days prior. The florid color had entirely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pallid grey. "Mr. Kensington," Thomas Sterling announced, placing a stack of legally binding transfer documents onto the mahogany desk. "The 72-hour covenant cure period has officially expired. As of this moment, Aegis Holdings is exercising its right to seize all collateralized assets under the terms of the consolidated mezzanine debt." Charles didn't yell this time. The fight had been systematically starved out of him. "You're liquidating my life's work," he rasped, his eyes hollow. 50 years of building this city, and you're stripping it for parts." "We are not liquidating it, Charles," David Harris corrected, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. "We are restructuring it under competent management. Your board of directors has already been dissolved. You are formally relieved of your duties as CEO, effective immediately. Security will require your building access cards and your corporate devices." "And my personal assets?" Charles asked, his voice trembling. "The duplex, the Southampton estate?" Thomas Sterling adjusted his spectacles. "As you used your holding company shares to cross-collateralize your personal mortgages, those properties are now technically owned by the Beaumont Trust. You and your daughter have exactly 14 days to vacate the Upper East Side residence. Sotheby's International Realty has already been retained to list the properties." The sheer surgical precision of the destruction was breathtaking. In less than a week, Chloe had reduced a man worth $800 million to a tenant facing eviction. Across town, Victoria Kensington was experiencing her own catastrophic descent into reality. She had spent the first 48 hours in absolute denial, convinced her father would pull off a miraculous restructuring. But when her American Express Centurion card was physically confiscated by a maître d' at Cipriani, the denial shattered. The social exile was instantaneous. In the hyper-insular world of New York's elite, poverty was treated as a highly contagious disease. Her invitations to the Met Gala after-parties were quietly rescinded. The women she had considered her closest confidants stopped answering her texts. When she tried to book an appointment at the John Frieda Salon, she was politely informed that they required a valid credit card on file before she could even enter the building. Desperation forced Victoria to act. She spent a humiliating afternoon in the back room of a luxury consignment store in Soho, offloading her collection of Hermes Birkin bags and Cartier love bracelets for a fraction of their retail value just to secure enough liquid cash to hire a moving company. When the 14th day arrived, Victoria stood in the echoing, empty foyer of her 4,000-square-foot duplex. The sweeping views of Central Park seemed to mock her. She was moving to a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, a neighborhood she had previously only seen from the window of an Uber on her way to JFK Airport. As she dragged her last suitcase out the door, she looked at her phone. She had one unread message from an unknown number. It was a single, devastatingly simple sentence. "I hear Queens is lovely this time of year." CB Victoria dropped her phone onto the marble floor, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracks, and finally began to weep. For Arthur Pendleton, the fall was not a sudden drop. It was a slow, agonizing slide over broken glass. Following his immediate termination from Oakmont Financial, he had retreated to a cheap, rented room in a shared apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey. His savings, which he had recklessly depleted to keep up with Victoria's extravagant lifestyle, vanished within 2 months. He had sold the Patek Philippe watch just to cover his mounting legal bills, as Oakmont had threatened to sue him for breach of fiduciary duty, though they eventually dropped it, deciding he wasn't worth the legal fees. Arthur assumed that, given his Ivy League pedigree and his aggressive track record, he would easily land on his feet. He began sending out his resume to every major investment bank, boutique advisory firm, and hedge fund in Manhattan. Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Point72. He applied to all of them. He received exactly 0 interview requests. At first, he thought it was a temporary hiring freeze, but after 3 months of deafening silence, Arthur reached out to a former colleague from Oakmont, a junior analyst who had always admired him. They met at a cheap diner in Midtown, far away from the polished mahogany bars Arthur used to frequent. "Arthur, you have to stop sending your resume around," the analyst whispered, looking nervously over his shoulder, as if merely speaking to Arthur could infect his own career. "You're blacklisted. Permanently." Arthur's stomach plummeted. Blacklisted? By Trent? Oakmont doesn't have that kind of reach. "It's not Oakmont," the analyst said, his eyes wide. "It's the Beaumonts. The word came down from the compliance departments at every major bank in the city. Aegis Holdings flagged your SEC registration with a failure to perform due diligence marker. No firm that does business with the Beaumont Trust, which is literally every firm on Wall Street, will touch you. You're radioactive, Arthur." Arthur sat in the dingy diner booth, the cheap fluorescent lights buzzing above him, and realized the terrifying scope of Chloe's revenge. She hadn't just fired him. She had systematically erased him from the financial ecosystem. She had locked the doors to the empire he had sacrificed everything to enter, and threw the key into an ocean he could never cross. Desperation bred humiliation. Unable to pay his dues, his membership at the Yale Club was unceremoniously revoked. His bespoke Tom Ford suits began to look absurd on the subway rides he now took to interview for jobs he previously would have sneered at. A year later, the aggressive, ambitious vice president of Oakmont Financial, was dead. In his place was a hollow, exhausted man working as an assistant branch manager at a retail commercial bank in a strip mall in Paramus, New Jersey. His days consisted of approving minor auto loans, listening to complaints about overdraft fees, and eating soggy sandwiches at a Formica desk. He lived in a perpetual state of quiet, agonizing regret. The final, crushing blow to Arthur's psyche arrived on a freezing Tuesday evening in November. He had just finished locking up the bank branch, pulling his thin wool coat tight against the biting wind. He walked over to a small, neon-lit sports bar next door to grab a cheap beer before the long bus ride back to his studio apartment. The bar was mostly empty, the televisions tuned to various news and sports channels. Arthur sat at the sticky counter, staring blankly at the glass in his hand. Suddenly, the bartender reached up and changed the channel on the primary television to Bloomberg News. The breaking news chyron at the bottom of the screen flashed in bright, aggressive red. Beaumont Global Holdings announces new leadership. Arthur's head snapped up. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. On the screen, a press conference was taking place in a massive gilded ballroom at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The global financial press was practically crawling over each other, camera flashes illuminating the room like a strobe light. Stepping up to the podium, flanked by heads of state and the world's most powerful financial regulators, was Chloe. She was devastatingly poised, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying sovereign power. She wore a severe, immaculate black suit, her dark hair pulled back into a sharp, elegant twist. As she looked out at the sea of reporters, her face was calm, analytical, and entirely untouchable. Today, we transition from the shadows into the operational light. Chloe's voice drifted out of the television speakers, crisp and authoritative. Beaumont Global Holdings will no longer act solely as a passive institutional investor. We are actively restructuring our portfolio to dictate the fiscal architecture of the next century. Arthur stared at the screen, tears of profound, agonizing loss welling in his eyes. He remembered the Bushwick apartment. He remembered the exposed brick, the clanging radiator, and the girl who had loved him purely, without condition, while possessing the power to buy the world 10 times over. He had held the keys to an absolute, unimaginable kingdom, and he had thrown them away for a cheap, leveraged illusion. Arthur placed a crumpled $10 bill on the sticky bar counter, walked out into the freezing New Jersey rain, and disappeared into the obscure, mediocre life he had built for himself. True wealth is rarely loud. It does not need to scream for validation, because it already owns the room. Arthur Pendleton's tragic flaw was his inability to distinguish between the superficial performance of success and the quiet, structural reality of absolute power. Blinded by greed and a hollow definition of ambition, he discarded genuine loyalty for a fragile mirage built on over-leveraged debt and social climbing. In his ruthless pursuit of the elite, he unknowingly betrayed the ultimate heiress, transforming his greatest asset into his most devastating adversary. Chloe Beaumont's vengeance was a masterclass in financial warfare, bloodless, surgical, and utterly absolute. She didn't just break his heart, she dismantled his entire reality, leaving him stranded in the very mediocrity he had spent his life running from. Ultimately, Arthur learned the hardest lesson of all. The most expensive mistakes are the ones made out of cheap arrogance.